Welcome to From the Trenches, success shortcuts revealed by real-world innovators crushing it right now. I'm your host, Scott Hartley, and we're back with another episode packed with actionable strategies from today's most successful entrepreneurs. If you're tired of generic business advice and ready for real cutting-edge tactics that are working right now, you're in the right place. And today we're diving deep into a topic that several of you have reached out to me about the value of interview-based podcasting for business owners. And I can't wait for my guest to share with you his transformational insights and experience in that industry. So I'd like to introduce you to now Dr. Robert Forteau. He was an early adopter of podcasting in business, and starting in 2009, he's never missed a week. And he's also spoken on stage at some of the largest podcasting conferences in the country. And he's a multi-business entrepreneur and lives with a team of sled dogs in the wilds of Alaska. Robert, so glad to have you on the podcast today.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. It is a pleasure. This is my first podcast interview of 2025, so let's kick it off right.
Awesome. Sounds great. Well, first off, I would love to kind of get a little bit of your backstory and just let our listeners know, about you. You seem to be kind of like me, that you could be a lifelong student. So you've been taking, some courses. You just finished up your doctorate degree. And I think I saw on Facebook that you're actually starting another course, I think maybe for a master's program. So tell us a little bit about what drives you with, being, such a student and what you're hoping to accomplish with all these educational pursuits.
Yeah, you're right. I have been in school for longer than I can remember. I started back as a second career, I guess you would, in college in 2014 with a second bachelor's degree, went on to do a master's and then just finished up a doctorate here in December. But I wanted to really focus in on something that's near and dear to me, and that was strategic media. And in particular, sports media. We have a magazine called Mushing Magazine. So I'm interested in learning some of the new tactics with that and all that. So I'm going to take some courses with that and see where that goes. But my actual career path, if you will, started way back in the early 90s. I was going to school to become a veterinarian. And I thought, man, I really don't want to spend all of my time in a vet office. So I started dog training in the parks of Portland, Oregon. I showed up with a business card, a leash, and a smile, and I started training soccer moms in the parks and whatnot. And that led from one thing to another. And we're still doing that to this day, well over 30 years later. And that is sort of fast forwarding to my podcast journey, which started in 2009, right about now, end of January 2009. And at the time, we were paying outrageous Yellow Page bills, something like $1,000, $1,500 a month or something like that. And we just couldn't sustain that. So we had to figure out a way to do something different. And podcasting was, the new shiny thing. And we started in our lobby of our dog training center in Denver. And it was really just answering our clients' questions. Why does my dog jump on the neighbors? Or why is my dog growling at the food bowl or whatever? And we put that up on the internet. And as you said, here we are all these weeks later, and we have never missed an episode.
Wow. So doing a podcast episode since 2009. So that's what, 14
almost
years?
Almost
15, 16 years?
Almost 16 years. Yeah, long time.
Wow. Wow, that is amazing. So I know that, obviously I'm doing this podcast really kind of for fun, with From the Trenches. Really the main reason that I started this podcast is because a lot of my clients were coming to me with all kinds of, business and marketing questions and things like that, and things that, I could answer, to a degree, but I'm not an expert in all of those fields. And I was like, I've got such a huge network of people that have so much expertise and knowledge. Like, why not create a platform where they could share that? And then, of course, my clients and other people can actually benefit from it. So for me, that's why I started this podcast, From the Trenches. It sounds like for you that your podcast, when you launched it, was really kind of like, hey, we want to try getting a new media, to offset some of the high cost of the Yellow Pages bills, and how can we attract clients but also serve them as well? Has that evolved over the years in the 16 years that you've been doing it, or what's kind of changed in that time?
Well, we've branched out in a bunch of different areas, but it by and large is our biggest marketing engine for our business. Since we do live here in Alaska, our market is relatively small compared to where we were in Denver with 4 million people. And if every other family has a dog, that's 2 million dogs that we could possibly serve just
Yeah.
in the Denver area. So we had to figure out a way to really branch out. And we, like you said, it was more client centric or lead centric focused at first, was figuring out how we could reach clients, how we could answer their questions, and of course, lead them into some type of magnet, whether they can, listen to us and then go for more information. So that worked out very well. But what
Hmm.
we found really worked, and sort of the title of this podcast episode was our interview based podcast, and how that can really help a kind of a consultant business or a coaching business grow. And I think that that's really where we hit the nail on the head, especially when I started interviewing authors and filmmakers and veterinarians and professionals in our field. Then we were able to network. And I think that was key because not
Hmm.
only did it provide a platform for us, but it provided a platform for them. So they could
Yeah.
get on, talk about whatever topic they're going to talk about, and then have a professional space where somebody else is asking questions. It's not like a Facebook Live or, something like that. We're just sort of talking to dead air. You at least have a platform where other people can ask you questions and sort of fire them back off and have that guided conversation. I think that's what really works well in that interview style podcasting. And I think that's what you're doing with your show, and it can easily pay dividends.
Yeah, and the fun part of it is like you get to meet so many different people. You get to go deep into conversations that you might otherwise not have. But it's also with that kind of the interview style, and especially the way that I do mine, is that I don't ask for questions. Like I didn't send you over and say, "Hey, Robert, send me a list of questions that you want me to ask." We're just kind of having a free flow conversation, and everybody who's listening in, they're just kind of like eavesdropping,
Yep.
on a conversation that you and I are having, happens to be over Zoom. So, I think, for a lot of people, and I know that this was a hang up of mine, I had the idea for a podcast for probably at least 2 years, because I've seen so many other people doing it. And I thought, well, it would be a lot of fun. But like, man, I've got to, try to find all of the people. I've got to handle all the booking. I've got to do all that back end production and all of that type of stuff. What's kind of your process or your methodology that's made it simple for you and something that you've been able to do long term now for 16 years?
Well, first off, it is not simple. It's something that takes a tremendous amount of work. I'm sure that you're very aware of this in your platform, if you will. I like to tell people that are thinking about starting podcast, and a lot of people have this itch, especially in today's age where they're looking for, instant gratification and quick likes and shares and all of that. My method or my idea of podcasting, it is about 3 to 1. So an hour of podcasting takes about 3 hours to do everything else, whether that's editing or promoting or talking to the guests or coming up with ideas for episodes or whatever. So when you think of it that way, if you're doing a half-hour show or an hour show a week, that's a significant amount of time that you have to carve out in order for that to
Mhm.
be successful. And I think a lot of people really miss that. They think, okay, I'm just going to sit down and record this with the microphone on my phone, or, buy a mic at Best Buy or whatever, and just sort of put it up there for the world and hope for the best. And obviously, it just doesn't work that way.
Mhm. Yeah. So what are some of the shortcuts that you've learned over the years that have kind of helped you hone in that process, even though, there still is that time investment that's required?
Well, one of the things that we always do is we schedule as much as we possibly can out. So we record every episode on Thursday or Friday afternoon for a Sunday drop. So all of our episodes always drop on Sundays at 4 a.m. Alaska time. So we're recording on Thursdays, doing all of that stuff, and then letting it sort of batch out and drop or kind of trickle out, I think is the best way to do that. So we're not constantly, okay, well, we recorded today. We have to do a Facebook post on Friday. We have to do a YouTube video on Saturday. We have to do a blog post on Sunday and all of that. We try to do as much batching as we possibly can. And that way everything's done and it just sort of flows that way from there. And one of our real nuggets, Scott, is once we record an episode, we do our best to make it an evergreen episode. So we try not to date stamp anything. We don't talk about, the weather or what are you doing on summer vacation or things like that, because we want to have those episodes, especially when we're interviewing guests for whatever they're promoting. We want to make sure that they can listen to it on the first week of January or the middle of July and it's still relevant, unless, of course, a book is just coming out or a film is going to be released or something like that. If we can figure out a way to make that evergreen and then trickle that out, that's where the real growth comes, I think, is just sort of having it there and sort of sitting it and forgetting it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love the idea of, batching, all of that work. So I usually try to schedule, my podcast recording sessions over the course of a week. And then, of course, those episodes. So like this one, you already alluded to, we're recording this in January. This is your first, interview for this year. But this is going to be released the first week in March. And so, I try to plan ahead because you never know what life is going to throw at you, right? And then, I try to get all of my recordings for the month of March. They're going to happen this week that we're recording. And that way next week, then I can sit down and do all of that back end processing work and have everything ready to rock and roll. And I don't have to worry about March when it comes and I can start working, on the weeks ahead. So what's, whenever you're thinking of people to interview, I know you said that you do a lot of interviews with people that are in your industry. How do you find those people? What do you say when you're reaching out to them? What's kind of your secret to getting guests to show up on your podcast?
Well, thankfully, since we've been doing this so long, we are inundated with guests from PR firms and, book publishers and all that. I don't know how many times a week somebody will shoot us over an email and say, hey, we've got this perfect guest for you. They just wrote this book about XYZ. We would love to send you a copy and have you have them on our show. And we do a lot of that. And our mode with that is if they're going to send us a book, I want time to read it because I don't want to go into something unprepared. And I have books upon books of that have come to us to do that. So I think that is one way, is to get in good with some type of organization like that. If you have that in your industry, whether it's a PR firm or a networking service or a booking agency or something like that, that works very well. And if you're working with larger guests or clients, reach out to who they deal with for their social engagement, whether it be their social media managers or their business managers or their secretaries or something like that. Reach out to them and just sort of develop those relationships and go forward. We do a lot of events. You had mentioned when you started, I've spoken at Podcast Movement and several other larger podcasting conferences and things like that. Those are great places, especially if you have a podcast that is not as niche as others. Like we said, every other family has a dog, so it's easy to talk about dogs. If you're talking about, I don't know, trying to think of a really niche one right off the bat, let's say that you are a cobbler making handmade shoes. I could imagine that may be a little difficult to fill up your podcast calendar with industry experts in the cobbling business, but just figure out a way to network, and I think you can go a long way with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the fun part of it is that you can even do a mix. So obviously, we're talking about the interview style, podcast, but like you said, when you started out, it was just simply creating podcasts that were answering questions or addressing problems, of your clients. So you could have a mixture of, of podcasts that it's like, hey, I'm bringing on a guest that's in our industry. They've written a book, whatever that case may be. But then you can also use some of your podcasts to share your own expertise, as well.
Yeah, we do that. That's exactly what we do. And what the way that we do it is I do all of the interview podcasts, and my wife, Michelle, my business partner, she does all of the how-tos or training tips, if you will. And she does those every week. And then I with my interviews, I do those as they come in. So I'm not on the mic as much as she is because by far our driver is that marketing point for our podcast, to get those clients. But if you can share it, I think it works out well. If you do have that tag team with a business partner or something that can get behind the mic a little bit and do it as well, I think that can help you out for sure.
Yeah. So when it comes to thinking about it, there's a lot of different options out there. You mentioned earlier, it's like, some people are just like, oh, I'll record it on my phone. And I think Russell Brunson, I think I heard him talk about whenever he first launched his podcast, he was basically doing like voice memos on his phone, and then he just uploaded those as a podcast. A great way to get started. But as you start to see like the results that you can get from a podcast, a lot of times you're like, I want to make it more of a production. What are some of the considerations that you keep in mind, or that you would recommend to people, when they're looking for, what type of equipment should they get? How deep should they go, down that path? What platforms, seem to be really good? Because I know there's a lot of different podcasting, platforms, things like that. What's kind of your recommendations when people are looking at that and not get overwhelmed by all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is everywhere from, the bottom of the list all the way up to the sky's the limit with any type of gear. And I'm sort of a gear junkie myself. I love trying out the new stuff. But for a long time, our podcast has been simulcast on one of the local radio stations here in Alaska. So they required us to have a little bit better stuff than the average person. So the microphone I'm on right now is way overkill for most people. I think it's about a $600 microphone. It's a Shure SM7B, which is sort of podcast industry standard. But yeah, you can start off with your phone. I would highly recommend plugging a USB mic or something to it to make it sound a little bit better, so it's not so tinny or echoey. And then really, really hone in on your craft and quit worrying so much about the gear. I think that is key. Making sure your message is across before the gear is overwhelming. We use, like I said, we're sort of that radio style, so we use a platform called Hindenburg for our editing. We have a Rodecaster Pro for our mixing board. Everything runs through Max. We have gear that we take out in the field. We have a mushing podcast, dog mushing podcast. So we take that out of the field with, weather heavy mics and all of that, with windscreens and all of that. All that stuff, Scott, is not necessary to produce a very good show as long as that message is being able to be portrayed. I will note, though, a bad audio is a very quick turnoff for podcast listeners, because you have to remember how people listen to podcasts. They're listening to them as they're doing something else. And often that means they're in their car or they're in your earbuds or something like that. So if you have really bad audio, you're going to have a turnoff very quickly. So spend some time, learn how to edit, take out the ums and the ahs and the extra spaces and all of that, and really hone your craft. And that's what's going to make you a good podcaster.
Yeah. So I love the fact that you mentioned that, the message is really what's the most important there. We can get caught up in all of the fancy bells and whistles of everything. But, a lot of times the quick and dirty can get us better results, right? Now, I do like the fact that you couch that with, okay, you do want to make sure your audio sounds good. You don't want to have, a bunch of scratchiness or, background noise or things like that, because if people can't hear your message well, then it's not going to get you the results that you want, right?
For sure.
Yeah. So, what are some other considerations? I mean, you've been doing podcasting way longer than I've even thought about it. What are some other considerations that if people are thinking about in 2025, it's like, I want to do a podcast. I want to promote my business. I want to try to get more clients. What are some other insights that you've learned over the years that would be helpful?
Well, last year I spoke at the Podcast Movement, and my topic was, it took us 8 years to get to 1 million downloads. And if you think about how long 8 years is, and sort of those pie in the sky dreams that a lot of people have in this instant gratification social media world, that is a very long time to reach that that threshold. And that's sort of the threshold that every podcaster wants to reach. Okay, I have 1 million downloads. Let's see what we can do with it. How can we monetize it? So on and so forth. But if you think about it, Scott, it doesn't matter how many you're listening to if that message is resonating with those people. So if you have an audience of 100 people and you're selling a $1,000 a month coaching program and 10% of those people sign up, that's $10,000 a month that is income from your podcast. So
Hmm.
don't worry too much about those audience numbers, but worry about that message and who you're talking to. I know you're a very niche specific podcast with your industry. You're talking to a very distinct clientele there. It's not going out to the masses, if you will. So reaching that audience is very important compared to my audience, where if we're talking to dog owners, if I'm talking about how to keep how to train your puppy, for example, that is a different segment of my audience than if everybody has an adult dog. So you
Yeah.
have to be very specific in that message. We can't just only talk about puppies or only talk about adult dogs or only talk about behavior problems or whatever, because that is limiting that audience as you're going through. So vary up your topics, vary up your conversations, vary up your interviews. Do not, I want to push this hard, do not vary up your production schedule. If you're going to say, I'm going to be a weekly podcast,
Mm.
no matter what, show up every week and be there. I can only imagine what it's like back in the day when you had old school TV and you go to Channel 3 and the Wheel of Fortune is not on at 7 o'clock. They have something else on. You freak out, right? Oh my goodness,
Yep.
where's Fortune? You're looking at the TV guide and doing all this other stuff. You do not want to have your clients that way as well, because the quickest way to an unsubscribe is not showing up. And I think that's true in any business, but particularly in podcasting.
Yeah, really everything in life and the success in business is simply showing up. If you do that, that's half of the battle, and then everything else just kind of like, comes naturally from there. And it can be challenging. And so, this is something that I've learned in the short period of time that I've been doing this podcast is you really have to block it out on your schedule. You have to be like, okay, this is the time I'm going to make my list of all my potential guests. This is when I'm going to reach out to them. This is, when we're going to do those recording sessions. This is when I'm going to do that post podcast production. Because if you don't put that on your schedule, life happens and then it doesn't happen. And then, oh, well, this week went by. I didn't have a podcast episode. Or instead of it coming out on Thursday, oh, it came out on Saturday. And your audience just won't stick around, if you have that type of, haphazardness.
Yeah, pod fade, as they call it, is a very real thing. The average podcaster makes it to about 7 episodes. So
Hmm.
think about all the podcasts out there. And if you go onto the Apple feed or Spotify or wherever you listen, you will find, if you look at their feeds, you'll see a very distinct drop, because it is not for the faint. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort. It can take a lot of money if you're spending gear and you have all these platforms that you're posting on and doing all this stuff. It can be a business in of itself. But yeah, you have to have realistic goals. This is a business lesson for just about anything. Have those realistic goals. Really sort of figure out what those are and find out a way to make them happen.
Yeah. Now, just out of curiosity, so with podcasts, I know that there are some people that they do really short, 10, 15-minute podcasts. There's others that go on, for hours, on end. What's kind of the sweet spot that you found for length on a podcast episode?
Our sweet spot is 30 minutes. And again, this is sort of industry specific. You talked about those really long podcasts. There's one called Hardcore History. His name is Dan Carlin. I think he has 4 or 5 hour episodes. So
Oh,
imagine
wow.
listening to those. That's like listening to an audiobook, right? But you're learning about World War I or whatever. That's a very in-depth podcast. But we do 30 minutes for a very specific reason, because we started this in Denver and we were trying to reach that market. And we figured out that the average commute in Denver, Colorado was about 30 minutes. So if
Okay.
we can come where they are turning us on when they get in the car and it's finishing up when they're pulling into the parking lot of their office, it is the sweet spot. And that has worked out for a long time. We have had those longer or shorter episodes, but that is not as much of a deal breaker, if you will, than you think. It
Mhm.
doesn't matter if you're doing a 5 minute episode this week and a 30-minute episode next, or an hour one next week or whatever. just make sure that that episode is tight, it is concise, it reaches that message. And if there is a lot of fluff, cut it out. People don't want to hear about the weather. They don't want to hear about what your kids are doing. They don't want to hear about your vacation. They want to hear about the message that you talk about in the title. If you're talking about interviewing podcasting tips, that's what we're talking about today. Get to the meat of it and make it happen.
Yeah, yeah, and I found that sometimes you can really nail that message in a really short amount of time, and then there's other times where you need to go deeper, and you can, especially if you've got a guest, you can really go deep depending on how good that interview is going. So fantastic stuff. One other question that I've heard differing views on, just curious about. Monetizing your podcast. So I know that there are some people that they're like, absolutely not. Like my content, I'm not going to outsource that. I'm not going to try to put other advertisers on there. But then I've got other people. It's like, yeah, I want to use every opportunity that I can to bring in revenue for my podcast. So they'll look for advertisers and they'll put those into the episodes. What's kind of your take on that?
It takes a long time to really build up an ability to be monetized, especially from the big networks. The average is about 10,000 downloads per episode. So if you're not reaching those, often the bigger advertisers will not even reach out to you. Once you reach that threshold, it's a little easier to add that monetization. One of the things that we have always done is we've always done dynamic ads, and dynamic ads for your listeners are ads that are based either on your location or your search. So if you're listening to this in Indianapolis, Indiana, you may hear about the local Ford dealership. You're listening to it in Alaska, you may hear it about a restaurant here in Anchorage or whatever. Those are dynamic ads, which are very, very good for monetization because they are so niche specific or location specific. Since we do try to reach out to clients, we do a lot of our own advertising for our own products. I think that is key. So we always do kind of a middle of episode ad drop in there, and typically that's our own ad. So we're talking about XYZ, then we'll do a 30-second break there and talk about one of our dog training programs or something that we're offering, and that works out very well because obviously our programs are much higher ticket than we would get if we're, doing, a basic ad or whatever. But monetization is not the be all end all. And I think so many people think I've got to get to this threshold and reach that. Don't worry about it. If it happens, it happens. Don't think that you're going to get those big sponsors, those big ads at the beginning. It takes a long time. Remember, I said it took us 8 years to get to 1 million. And that's a long time. Every week is that 400 episodes or something like that at 8 years at 52 weeks. It was a long time before we reached that.
That's a lot of episodes. So but that's really good. So, well, I know we're getting close to our time here, but are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience that I haven't thought about asking questions about?
Jump behind the mic and let it rip. Your first episodes are going to be bad. Don't worry about it. People are not going to think, well, here I am at episode 200 and I listened to Scott's first episode. Man, it was really bad. I'm not going to listen anymore. You get better for sure. It takes a while. It is sort of kind of a muscle memory type thing to sit behind this mic. If you can have a co-host or a guest, it is so much easier than talking to a computer screen with a microphone. Nobody else. Find a co-host, find a friend, something. And then I think the biggest tip, if I could, is have realistic goals and expectations. And I think that you'll go into this with a clear idea of what to expect.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, my first few episodes they sucked. I won't even go back and listen to them because I know that they were horrible. But you do get better, and I've seen repeatedly over the past week or so on Facebook, especially all those things. It's like wherever you're starting, the first times are always going to be really bad, but you're going to get better. But you have to get those first reps in order for anything to become of it. So, well, Robert, I really appreciate your time here. I know that the main topic of our episode today was talking about podcasting, but I do want to give you an opportunity to just kind of briefly mention the dog training stuff that you do. How can people find out more information about dog training? Because like almost everybody I know has a dog.
Well, you can find me on any social at Robert Forto. That's Robert Forto. I'm on all socials with that. Our dog training company is called Alaska Dog Works, and our podcast is Dog Works Radio. I would love to have you come over there and join us. And if you have a dog, if you have a question, if you are in that space where you would love to be a guest, we would be happy to have you.
Awesome. Well, definitely check out Robert's social media. You can stay up with all of his educational journeys. That's always fun and interesting to follow as well. But thanks for joining me today. And that's all for today's episode of From the Trenches. If you're looking to supercharge your email marketing, check out my book, Hit the Inbox, at hittheinboxbook.com. It's packed with 76 pages of strategies to get your emails landing in inboxes and driving sales. Thanks for tuning in today. If you found value in this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite platform. It helps us reach more entrepreneurs like you. And until next time, keep crushing it in the trenches.